Hello, my friends. How are you? I have something that I want to show you. It's very heavy. This is my heart-shaped rock collection. Can you see that? These are all rocks that I have found or friends have found for me, and they all shape like a heart. And here's a picture of me. That's when I was in Hawaii, and I found one made out of volcanic rock, lava from a volcano that shaped like a heart, but it was too big to go in my suitcase, so I just have a picture of it. But those are all my heart-shaped rocks, and the reason that I wanted to show you rocks that shape like a heart is because we're telling a love story. The story that we've been telling the last few weeks is the greatest love story ever told. And it's the story of how God so loved the world, y'all know this, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And last week we learned that Jesus died for us, not after we were good, because nobody's good enough, right? He died for us while we were still sinners. That's a love story right there. And we learned about all the things that he did for us because he loved us so much and he wanted to be with us. So what I wanted to remind you is about this scarlet thread that we talked about last week. And you remember, Brother Clark says that there's a scarlet thread that runs through the whole Bible. The reason it's scarlet, which is red, is for Jesus' blood. And we talked about how in the Old Testament we learned that God made a perfect world, a perfect man, a perfect woman, and a perfect garden where there was no hunger, there was no pain, there was no sadness. But those people sinned. And when they sinned, they broke their friendship with God. And so God made a way for our friendship to come back together, and that way was through Jesus' blood. So all through the Old Testament, God tells us that he's going to send the Messiah. Remember, the promised deliverer is going to come. And all through the Old Testament, he tells us, this is how you're going to know when it's him. Now, I like this Bible. This is a Bible that was my daughter's when she was younger. It's called the Young Women of Faith Bible. And I like this because our story this week is in the book of John. And when I look in here, it tells me some details about the book of John. Who was John? John was a disciple of Jesus. Remember, a disciple is someone who learns from someone. So he sat at Jesus' feet when Jesus taught, and he learned from him. And he wrote the book of John. Why was this book written? This is very important. The book of John was written so that we would know that Jesus is God's Son. God said, I'm going to send my Son. You need him. You need him to get into heaven, and I'm going to send him. And so this book tells us this is how we know that this is God's Son. Who was it written for? It was written for anybody who wants to believe. Anybody who needs to be saved to go to heaven. And remember, that's everybody, because everybody sins, right? So what happens in this book? And there's a nice little breakdown here. It starts off, Jesus chooses his disciples, those 12 men that were to be his friends and to learn under him. We learn a story of Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one of the religious leaders, and he came to Jesus by night, and he asked Jesus, how can I go to heaven? And Jesus explained to him, anybody that wants to go to heaven has to be born again. That's what we call being saved. That's when you admit you're a sinner and you believe what's said in this book, that Jesus is God's Son, and you give your life to him. He told Nicodemus how to do that, and we read about Nicodemus. It tells us how to do it, right? And it goes on through all of Jesus's miracles, many, many miracles that he did when he was on earth. And then it talks about his last hours with his disciples and the things he taught them. And remember, the things he taught them, we can read and it'll teach us. And then he prayed for his disciples. And when he prayed for them, he said, I don't just pray for these 12 friends, but I pray for those who will believe later. That's us. Jesus prayed for us. It talks about when Jesus was crucified, when he rose from the dead on Easter. And then this, what we're going to hear about today, is when Jesus forgives Peter. It's a very good story. So Sunday morning, now that's Easter, that's this last Sunday what we celebrated. Sunday morning, after the women found the empty tomb, remember they went to where Jesus was buried, to wash his body and care for his body, and his body wasn't there anymore. We know why, right? Because he had gone to heaven. So Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb, and she was crying because Jesus was gone. And when she turned around, she saw someone there. Now, there's a reason that I'm in my garden today, because when she saw this, she thought it was a gardener. And she said to, she didn't, it was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. He didn't let her recognize him. And Jesus asked him, "Why are you crying? Who is it that you're seeking?" Now, Mary thought it was the gardener, and she said, "Sir, please, if you put him somewhere, please tell me where you put him." And Jesus said one word. He said her name, Mary. And as soon as he said that, she turned around and she said, "Rabboni," which means teacher, because he was her teacher. She was one of the ones that was learning from him. Then she hurried off to tell the disciples. Now, that's what we should do. When we have an encounter with Jesus, the first thing we should be bursting to tell other people about it, right? She couldn't wait. She ran through the streets of the city, and she ran to the disciples, and she said, "I've seen him. I have seen the Lord." Now, on Sunday evening, Jesus died on Friday. He rose on Sunday, and this is that night. The disciples were all together, and if you remember, they were scared. They were hiding. They were hiding in what we call the upper room, where they had the Last Supper with Jesus. They were afraid that what had happened to Jesus was going to happen to them, so they had the doors locked. They didn't even light the candles because they didn't want anybody to know that they were there. And suddenly, Jesus was there. He just appeared. He didn't open the door and walk in. He was just there. And he said, "Peace to you." The disciples realized that it really was Jesus, and they celebrated, but one of the disciples was not there. His name was Thomas. And I often wonder, where was Thomas? Did he go to get them something to eat, maybe? Did he go check on his mom and daddy? The Bible doesn't really tell us where Thomas was, but he wasn't there in the room. And so as soon as he came back, what do you think the first thing they told him was? As soon as he walked in the door, they said, "We saw Jesus. Jesus was here." And Thomas didn't believe them. We call him Doubting Thomas. And when I was a little kid, if one of us didn't believe something, my mama would say, "Don't be a doubting Thomas." But Thomas said, "I will not believe that Jesus was here unless I can see the marks on his hands where the nails went in, and then I will believe." Well, 8 days later, they were together again, and this time Thomas was with them, and again the doors were locked, and Jesus was just there. All of a sudden, he was just there. And he came and stood to them, and he said again, "Peace to you." Next, Jesus spoke to Thomas. Now, Jesus knew what had happened because he's God. He knows everything. And he said, "Thomas, look at my hands. Here, touch them. You can put your fingers in the nail holes. Don't be afraid, and don't be an unbeliever. Believe." And Thomas answered and said, "My Lord and my God." He believed that it was Jesus, and Jesus was there. And this is what Jesus said, and I really like this. He said, "You have seen me, Thomas, and so you believe. But blessed are those who do not see me and believe." Guess who Jesus was talking about there? He was talking about you and me. So earlier when he was with the disciples, he was praying for us. He was praying that God would keep the devil away from us, that the devil wouldn't be able to hurt us. And here he's talking about us, because you and I don't see Jesus. He doesn't just poof appear in our room like that. We didn't get to walk around with him and eat with him and laugh with him and do all those things, but yet we believe in him. And so he was saying we are blessed because we believe in Jesus. That's a good story, huh? Well, I thank you all for coming here and being with me today, and over the last few weeks we've been telling these stories, and next week we're going to tell a very special story. It's about my friend Peter. Y'all know how much I like Peter. And we're going to tell a special story about something that happened to Peter. I love y'all, and I'll see you next week.